By and large, the policy paid off, and former bitter enemies became Henry's loyal lieutenants. Only one thing remained.
Henry's smartest move was to make his peace with the unquiet ghost of Richard II. Henry IV had accorded Richard the dignity of a public funeral, but he'd refused him burial here in the Abbey. The result was that Richard's memory continued to plague his successor. Miracles took place at his modest tomb. His name was constantly invoked to justify rebellion. Many refused to believe that he was dead at all. So when Henry V became king, he moved to tackle the problem with his characteristic decisiveness. And in December 1413, only 8 months after his own coronation, Richard's body was brought to Westminster Abbey in a magnificent procession and reburied amongst his fellow kings here in the tomb which Richard had commissioned for himself. The stain of 1399 was wiped out, and Henry was able to benefit from the usurpation without incurring the stigma or the bad conscience of his father.
Having settled domestic politics, Henry was able to turn his attention to the project that would dominate his reign, the War of Conquest with France. Henry needed war. The reign of the peace-loving Richard II had shown that the English war monarchy of the Edwards was ungovernable in peace. Better that the English nobles should fight the French than each other or their king. But Henry's claim to France was also, for this intensely religious man, an article of faith.
For Henry, the war was essentially about justice. From his ancestor, Henry II, he'd inherited claims to the whole of the Angevin Empire, of Normandy, Anjou, and of Aquitaine, whilst from his other ancestress, Isabella of France, the Queen of Edward II, he claimed the throne of France itself. Only let these claims be conceded, Henry announced, and there would be no war.
From the French point of view, this was an outrageous demand, and they refused. Denied his legitimate claim, Henry's conscience was now clear. The French had refused peace with justice, so the god of battles must decide. Henry set sail for France on the 11th of August, 1415. His first campaign is the stuff of legend and drama. For Harry, England and St. George. This was the battle cry that Shakespeare gave the English soldiers on the field at Agincourt. Here, Henry showed himself everything that an English king should be: resolute, heroic, and a born leader of men. The English soldiers were far outnumbered by the French, perhaps by 3 to 1, but fired up with loyalty to their king and country, they won an astounding victory. It seemed proof positive that Henry V was God's chosen king. It was also proof that Henry's war policy could work. Within 2 years, Henry was back. This time, his aim was conquest. The English army swept through Normandy, systematically besieging and capturing the greatest cities, Caen, Falaise, and Rouen. But the key to France was Paris. Rather than risk reuniting the French by attacking the capital, Henry, who was a subtle politician as well as a dashing general, decided to exploit the profound divisions within the French court. He made apparently enormous concessions. He would no longer claim Western France as heir of Henry II. The present King of France could even keep his title. The ploy worked. By a treaty signed here at Troyes, Henry seemed to have won the prize that had eluded even Edward III.
By the terms of the treaty, Henry was recognized as the legitimate heir of the present King of France, Charles VI, whose daughter Catherine he married a few days later. In other words, Henry was seeking to apply in France that same model of traditional kingship which had served him so well in England. He would rule France not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate king. And above all, he promised he would bring peace with justice.
On the 1st of December 1420, Henry entered Paris in triumph as heir and regent of France. He was warmly received, and the French Parliament ratified the Treaty of Troyes. It remained, it seemed, only to mop up opposition. But suddenly, at the age of only 35, Henry caught dysentery and died. In only 9 years, Henry V had reunited England and taken France. And he'd done it all as a consciously English king, speaking and writing English even for official documents. For the first time since the Norman conquest, England was a nation-state once more.
This is the upper story of the splendid funerary chapel of King Henry V. The king's image below was originally covered in silver gilt, while amongst the rich sculptures are 2 coronation scenes representing Henry's 2 kingdoms of England and of France. But what really impresses is the sheer scale and the magnificent location of the chapel, directly at the east end of the abbey. Here, they say, is the apogee of the medieval English monarchy and the monument of the perfect medieval king. The institution could scarcely go any higher. Could it even survive at its present high water mark? Everything would depend on Henry's son, the 9-month-old infant who, in his cradle, was heir of England and of France.
On the 1st of September 1422, Henry V's infant son became the new King of England as Henry VI. If this was not enough, 2 months later, his French grandfather died, and Henry was also named King of France. The new king was a 9-month-old baby, but the polished machinery of English government adapted easily. The nobility made arrangements for the cradle king. The government of England and France was divided between the king's 2 uncles, each assisted by a council. This enabled the English to hold on to the conquests of Henry V, but French resistance couldn't be suppressed. In 1431, Henry's council decided that the time had come for the 10-year-old Henry VI to take possession of his second kingdom of France. Henry was taken to Notre Dame, where he was crowned, but he stayed in Paris for less than a month. This was his first and last visit to France. Henry VI was very different from his father. Whilst Henry V had spent over half his reign fighting in France, Henry VI showed no interest in war at all. Instead, his passion was religion.
How a king wishes to be remembered takes us to the heart of his kingship. And this is the chosen monument of Henry VI, son of the warrior king, Henry V. But it's not a battlefield or a great castle. Instead, it's the chapel of Eton College. Nowadays, we think of Eton as perhaps the most famous school in the world. But the school was incidental to Henry's purpose. Instead, he was interested in size. He wanted this chapel to become one of the biggest, richest, and holiest churches in England, as long as Lincoln Cathedral, as wide as York Minster, his very own Westminster Abbey. But thanks to constant changes of plan, which led him to demolish parts already built and start again, only this fragment was finished at the time of his fall from power. It's an apt symbol of a reign that began with high hopes and a magnificent inheritance and ended in failure and disaster.
But not merely was Henry unwarlike. Once he took government into his own hands, he pursued an active peace policy. He was even prepared to surrender parts of his father's conquests. This was hugely unpopular with the English nobles who'd done so well out of the war. The most dramatic signal of Henry's intentions came when, at the age of 22, he married a French princess, Margaret of Anjou.
Margaret was the symbol of the controversial peace policy with France. After she came to England and married her impressionable husband, Margaret became more than the symbol of the peace party. She became its most effective partisan. And the English always distrusted politically active queens, especially when they were foreign, and especially when, like Margaret, they looked suspiciously like a French secret agent at the heart of the English court.
Soon, the worst English fears had come true. By the time Henry was 30, he'd lost everything that his father had won. Only Calais remained in English hands. Thanks to Henry, 100 years of war with France had yielded nothing. And the prestige and the glory of the English crown were destroyed.
But most lethal for the monarchy was the fact that the war, like most unsuccessful wars, had been marked by vicious quarrels between the English generals. The most dangerous was the feud between Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund, Duke of Somerset. Both were members of the royal house, whilst York arguably had a better claim to the throne than Henry himself. In the aftermath of defeat, their quarrel had translated itself into English domestic politics when Somerset became Henry's chief minister, whilst York set himself up as the leader of an increasingly disloyal opposition.
In 1450, the antagonism turned into open conflict, and a popular revolt temporarily seized control of London. 2 years later, York himself took up arms, claiming he was not rebelling against the king, but against his evil councillors, principally Somerset. York won little support and surrendered when Henry promised to dismiss Somerset. But the king broke his word, and Somerset and his ally Queen Margaret seemed impregnable. Then, suddenly, Henry had a fit of madness.
3 months after the onset of Henry's illness, his wife, Queen Margaret, gave birth to a son. After nearly 8 years of childless marriage, the future of the Lancastrian dynasty seemed secure. But Henry acknowledged his son only with a flickering of his eyes, and he could not even raise a finger in the government of his kingdom. But without a king as the final